Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at this Labour Unions TULO webinar this evening. My name is Helen, I'm the Director of Labour Unions, and we are the organisation that represents the 12 trade unions that are affiliated to the Labour Party. So we're effectively the bridge between the Labour movement and the Labour Party. And our job together is to ensure that the collective voice of working people is right at the heart of our party. Now, these are obviously unprecedented times, and the phrase I have heard again and again this week is that there has never been a better time to join a trade union. And that could be because you're worried about staying safe at work. It could be because you're worried about the security of your job and your income. But it's by joining a union you can best protect yourself and your workmates. As Angela Rayner said this week in an email to party members, a union is a way of saying, I have got your back and you have got mine. It's clear that we've been forced by the pandemic into a time of massive change. That's change in our work, home, social and family lives. For many of us, we're worried about juggling work and homeschooling, about how secure our jobs are, about whether we'll be kept safe by our employer if we do have to go to work. Some people are having to make awful decisions between going to work or losing income to stay home and stay safe. And for too many people, obviously, it's also meant grieving for loved ones. A lot of the pieces of life as we know it have been thrown up in the air, and we don't yet know how all this is going to play out and how it will land. We've seen some glimmers in some places, a stronger sense of community and looking out for our neighbours, a consensus that those key worker heroes that we clap for every week have been underpaid and undervalued for far too long, and that needs to change. And a real push this week in particular for people to join a union, and seeing those unions playing a crucial role as partners in agreeing those solutions that protect workers' jobs and public health. But as we've seen the beginnings of an easing of lockdown this week, we've also seen that old power imbalance in the workplace in action. Too many workers fall back to work in conditions that don't sufficiently protect their health and safety. Talk in the papers this morning of a public sector pay freeze, the lowest paid, most at risk. And some employers also beginning the process of making workers redundant, and too many of those workers without a recognised union to speak with one voice on their behalf. Now, after the pandemic, we are going to have to rebuild our society and our economy, but it's clear that we don't have to simply rebuild back to what we had before. All of those pieces have been thrown up in the air, but we, as activists in the party and in the trade union movement, can help shape where those pieces land. We don't have to accept that the old way of doing things was the only way and the right way. Unions have long been advocating for a new deal for working people, and this evening we're going to have the first in what we hope will be a series of discussions on what that new deal could look like. If we're going to have a new normal, let's make sure it is better, it is fairer and it is more equal than the old one. Now, we are really lucky to have two fantastic speakers tonight. We're joined by Dave Ward, who is the General Secretary of the Communication Workers Union, who has long been a leading advocate for a new deal for workers, and Kate Bell, who's Head of Rights International, Social and Economics at the TUC. They talk to us about why we need a new deal for working people, what it would look like and how we win it. And Kate is also going to give us a brief update as well on the latest info about workers going back into workplaces and about how to keep them safe, what you should do if you're worried that you're not safe at work. After we've heard from them, there'll be a chance to ask some questions, which my colleague Jo is going to moderate, and we should be wrapped up by about 7 o'clock. If you want to ask a question, there's a little button at the bottom of the screen that you can click. Dave is going to kick us off. We've had a few tech problems, so we're unfortunately not able to have Dave join us on the screen, but Jo is going to broadcast Dave down the line to you now. So with no further ado, over to Dave. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jo and Kate and everybody. General Secretary of the Communication Workers Union having a few technical problems with communication links. I think it's our own IT that's restricting me getting on at the moment. So I can hear the other guys, but I wish I could have joined you as well on screen. We as Helen said, the CWU has, I think, been the probably leading voice in the trade union movement in calling for a coalition of unions to come together and fight for a new deal for workers. We do that because of what we see in our own workplaces, our own industries, and I suppose the result of decades and decades of neoliberal politics that has meant that we now see an economy in the UK that is absolutely built on insecure work, austerity, and low pay and low productivity. And, you know, one of the things that I'd like to make, I suppose, to really kick us off here is that, you know, this crisis, the pandemic that we're now dealing with, we as a labour movement have to make it absolutely clear that the government and the problems that are arising from this crisis, they haven't actually come from the virus. They've come from the way that decades of policies by successive governments at times have led us to, you know, real problems where people and their families are one paycheck away from absolute disaster. You know, we've got a situation, I think the TUC put out some notes the other day that was saying that 4 in 10 of key workers are actually paid £10 or less an hour. So, you know, I mean, what we need to do is recognise that Boris Johnson is trying to claim almost the spirit of 1945, when after the Second World War, you know, it was Labour that built the National Health Service, built the welfare state. Out of a crisis came a fresh start for working class people. And, you know, that's a superficial leadership that we're seeing. The real leadership that's going to take this forward is the labour movement, the trade union labour movement. And I have to say, all of these fantastic organisations that have sprung up in recent years who really get to a grassroots level of connecting with people, renters associations, some of the self-help groups that are out there at the moment. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in getting the New Deal for workers moving forward is to be able to harness all of those groups, all of those people that are fighting for people with all the right values at the moment. This is fertile ground for what I call a new model of collectivism. I have a view that the Labour Party structures and the trade union structures themselves sometimes can be too rigid, can be too bureaucratic in order to harness and, you know, all of those groups that are out there fighting for the real campaign, which should be a new deal for working class people. So we have to be a bit flexible in how we deal with that. But I do really believe, you know, there are great opportunities here to change the whole way that the economy is run. You know, I mean, we're gonna face the economic fallout of this at some point. But they faced that after the Second World War, and they didn't choose to start going back to austerity. They chose to rebuild the whole of the UK. And trade unions, in my view, need to lead that debate. I have to say, I think the TUC in recent weeks are putting the government on the spot and holding the government to account. And some of the good stuff that's come from the government has come directly as a result of the pressure that trade unions, the TUC, have been putting on the government. You know, we forced them to go backwards to where they should have been at times when they wanted to go, you know, and remove some of the things that they're claiming now, you know, they're helping the country with. So, you know, we're playing a great role in this, and the TUC have done well. And Francis O'Grady, I think, has done particularly well in leading that debate. So, a new deal for workers. I'm going to put forward 3 or 4 points that I think we can build around. I'm a great believer that you have to start building from a very simple understanding of what is needed to be done. We know what's happening. We now need to say to people, why don't we do these things to build what could turn into a new deal, a life-changing deal for people in the UK. So the first thing that I'm going to say is that trade unions must, out of this, come together in sectors of the economy, and we must agree common bargaining agendas. And every single trade union in the country that's organising, instead of fighting each other for members and internal competition, I don't mean literally fighting each other, but, you know, instead of seeing the world through the lens of our own particular union, we need to see it through the lens of the workers who want to, I believe, join organisations like unions, and we need to work together to show them that in sectors of the economy, we will chase down employers now, and we will root out everywhere insecure employment models. It's an outrage that the basic contract that people used to take for granted, that had holiday pay, sick pay, has disappeared in so many jobs in this country. And we are the vehicle for fighting for that in the right way, to get people behind us and change the face of insecure employment. So that's the first thing. Let's agree common bargaining agendas in sectors of the economy. I'm willing, as General Secretary of the CWU, to work with Unite, to work with GMB in some of the sectors where they organise and we organise. We're up for doing that, and I know they are. The second thing is we've got to be open to these new models of collectivism. And it may be that we need to use digital platforms to actually create a place where, rather than going straight into this particular union or that union, we need the campaign to be built around platforms where people can join the campaign and then move from there into the particular union that best suits them. So, I'm up for creating a real close working relationship now across the trade union movement. I believe in the identity of these groups that are out there organising on the front line people to join their organisations. You have to let them have that identity, but we have to find a way of harnessing that. So greater cooperation between the trade union movement on that, more flexibility in our structures is the second point. The third point is a charter that sets out the demands. And we need to do a bit more work on that. There's been work that's been done previously. Trade unions had set out, it went to the TUC last year. We need to relook at that in light of this particular...
I think we lost Dave there, sadly. I'll try and get him back. Afraid not.
We'll try and get Dave back on the line later on and hear from him then. Apologies for the technical problems we've had this evening. So the new way of working, we're all going to have to get used to these digital platforms. Sometimes they are tricky and pose unexpected problems, but we will try and get Dave back on the line later on. I'm going to pass over to Kate Bell from the TUC now, who can talk a little bit about the current situation, but also put some flesh on the bones in terms of the work that the TUC have been doing on the New Deal, and also just sort of echoing what Dave was saying in terms of what are the problems we need to overcome and how do we unite to create the change that we all want to see. Thanks, Kate. Over to you. Oh, I think your mic's off, Kate.
Better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for reminding me to turn my mic on, always a key point of this type of discussion. I should probably say the TUC, of course, represents 48 member unions, both affiliated to the Labour Party and not, but really brilliant to be part of this discussion and really great to have an opportunity to listen to most of Dave Ward, who's done so much work to champion that New Deal for working people. So I think there were four main things I wanted to say, and I'll try and keep it quite brief so we've got time for questions. So first, I think we really need to acknowledge that this crisis has had awful effects for working people. And it's had particularly terrible effects for the people that trade unions were really kind of founded to represent. We saw those horrific figures from the Office for National Statistics this week, telling us things like male security guards were 4 times more likely than the average worker to face the risk of death from the coronavirus. Female hairdressers 3 times more likely. male workers in trade 3 times more likely. And we've heard a lot about this kind of people saying the pandemic doesn't discriminate. I think we have seen the people who are most exposed are those working people who we are formed to represent, who can't work from home, who are having often to take public transport for work, and who've been repeatedly let down by confused government messaging, by the failure to get adequate personal protective equipment into workplaces. And I think, it's really important when we're talking about how we build back better that we just recognise how awful this crisis has been for those people. I think the second thing I wanted to say is one thing, and it kind of builds on that, is that, as Dave was saying, this crisis has thrown up and kind of shown up many of the problems that I'm sure many people on this call knew about and were talking about long before the crisis, but it's really shown those problems into kind of stark relief. It's shown how people who do some of the most valuable work are some of our most underpaid. Dave cited our stats that 4 in 10 key workers earn less than £10 an hour. You shouldn't have to be putting your life on the line to justify having a pay rise, but I still think those figures are pretty shocking. It's shown us the problems of insecure work, whether that's the 1 million people on 0 hours contracts, whether that's the outsourcing that's being rife across the public sector, whether that's the forced self-employment that far too many people face. And I think it's shown us not just the insecurity that those workers face, but how those kind of insecure employment models have made it much harder actually to deliver our public services, to make sure that our care homes are safe, to get the personal protective equipment we need to people, to make sure that cleaners in the NHS are protected by the reasonably good kind of pay protections in the NHS. We've also seen how too many employers treat their workforces with contempt. You'll probably remember at the beginning of this pandemic where Wetherspoon's attitude to its workforce was, don't come in tomorrow and we're not going to pay you. Actually forced to kind of retreat a bit on that because of some of the kind of public reaction. But, a really visible sign of what many people have known is that too many workers for a long time have been treated kind of like disposable labour. We've seen bosses, really treating their workforces with contempt, and some of the kind of awful situations we've seen, again, with people facing health risks, I think have shown us that fact that working people just haven't had a voice, haven't been able to speak up, and haven't had enough power. The third thing I think we have seen in this crisis, though, and I'm trying to move through a kind of positive and get more positive as I move on, is that trade unions really have made a difference. We've been instrumental in negotiating that job retention scheme, which we know is now protecting 7 million people's jobs and not all of their income. It's not perfect, there are holes, but I think a really, really important thing in both protecting jobs and protecting livelihoods. We know many people already are losing their jobs, 2.6 million claims for universal credit, but I think we do know there'd be many, many more if it wasn't for that job retention scheme. We think we have been influential in calling out the government for its absolutely chaotic communications on Sunday, which I think will have really worried people right across the economy about when it's safe return to work, but actually negotiating some improvements on the guidelines. We forced the government to say that employers should be publishing risk assessments, they should be carrying out those risk assessments. And from the version of the guidelines on work that we first saw, there's several improvements in there around kind of things that the government must consider, around better protections around protected groups, particularly around pregnant women, and making sure that employers do have to be considering equality considerations when they do those health and safety assessments. Of course, we know that's not good enough yet for people to have that safe return to work they need. Not clear enough yet what's happening with public transport, not clear enough yet if you can't go to work because you haven't got any childcare, because your schools haven't opened. Still, I think, real concerns about when those schools are going to open, and still no legislative requirement on the government to publish those risk assessments, which is something we're pushing for. But we know that whether it's at that kind of national level or whether it's in the kind of workplaces across the country where many, many working people have been able to speak up about health and safety, where unions have been able to negotiate better protections in supermarkets, for example, finally on London buses for their workers, unions have shown just how vital they are throughout this crisis. The fourth thing I've wanted to say, and final thing really, is we absolutely have to learn the lessons of this crisis to build something better when we come out of it. I think, those kind of problems we've shown up were here before the crisis. And I really liked how Dave put it, saying, many of the issues we faced haven't been caused by the virus, they've been caused by our broken economic model. But we know we need to campaign for at least a £10 minimum wage for all workers. We know we need to be campaigning for a public sector pay rise, not the kind of austerity we saw threatened on the front page of the Telegraph today. We know we desperately need that ban on 0 hours contracts and a real effort to crack down on false self-employment. Sick pay for all, that's what we went into the crisis kind of focusing on, still not fixed, some minor improvements in who can get it, but still a kind of paltry level of £94 a week and around 2 million people missing out on the opportunity to get sick pay because they don't earn enough. We know we need that end to outsourcing. So, for example, that cleaners in the NHS face decent pay, conditions and protections. And we know we need what we've needed for a long, long time now is that right for unions to access workplaces so that more people can actually get the benefit of joining a union. I think it's particularly important at the moment that we make that right a digital right as well. I think unions have been talking for a while now about kind of online organising. We're all having to innovate a bit quickly in this crisis, but we have shown that, we can move a lot of our activity online when we need to, and that should kind of, well, more or less, it's not easy. But, if this was a public event, if we were all doing this face to face, one of us would probably have got, stuck on the tube somewhere and have been 10 minutes late. So all mediums face their challenges, but absolutely vital that access to workplaces, is a real right for unions and a digital right as well. I think one thing we have seen in this crisis is that government can move quickly when it thinks, it has to. Lots and lots of things which we've wanted for a long time, whether it's faster action to tackle homelessness, whether it is that support for jobs and wages, actually a £20 increase in the level of benefits, still deeply, deeply inadequate. And the other thing I meant to say actually is we absolutely have to see fixing our social safety net, something that we're fighting for as we come out of this crisis. But we have seen that government can act quickly, that it can listen to unions. And I think that's absolutely what we've got to fight for as we come out of this. Just 2 pieces of advertising I wanted to do before I stop. TUC is doing our own event on a better recovery, which is next Wednesday from 10 to 11. Hopefully you can see that advertised on our Twitter feed or at least on mine. And lastly, if there's anyone on this call who isn't a member of a union already, if you Google TUC join a union, that will take you straight to Union Finder, and then you can find out which is the best union for you. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you. That was really a good tour of the role of trade unions in the current crisis, the difference they are making both nationally in pushing things with government, but also in all of those workplaces across the country where it's union reps who are in there and sort of having the discussions with employers to get safe practice the best it can possibly be. And as you say, the one message that we're all united on this week is absolutely join the union. There has never been a more important time. I am delighted to say that I think we have Dave Ward back on the line. So I'm going to pass over to Joe, who's going to bring Dave back to us as we obviously everyone's really eager to hear the rest of his points. So thanks, Dave, for making it back, and over to you, Joe.
Sorry about that, Helen. I don't know what happened there. I was just about to make the and then the government intervened, cut me off. So no, I'll finish quickly because obviously we're going to do some questions. So yeah, just to recap, 3 points. Common bargaining agendas, 1. That unions must now work together on. 2. Greater cooperation and flexibility in harnessing a coalition in support of a new deal for workers. And there's room for all the self-help groups, all of the associations that have built up as part of that. And 3 is our charter of demands. And finally, we do need action. We do need to plan for action. No one's going to hand this to us, but we need to think carefully about what shape that action takes place in. So I think that's an agenda for the next couple of weeks. I'd throw in as well, sorry, I'm getting an echo. I'd throw in as well that, let's not forget, as well as the economic fallout of this crisis that we're going to have to deal with, we also still face the prospect imminently of the impact of the 4th industrial revolution. that's going to have a major impact on the world of work. And we also have to deal with climate change. Now, you can look at these things as major problems. I don't see it that way. I look at them as real opportunities to advance the cause of working class people, to change society for the better. And I'm actually quite optimistic that with the work that we're doing now, if we can find one narrative that everybody can coalesce around, which I think is under the banner of a New Deal for Britain, starting with a New Deal for workers, I think we can make huge strides forward. And, we're up for that in the CWU, and talking to a lot of other unions, I know they are as well. So let's bring that on.
Fantastic. Thank you to both of our wonderful speakers for those excellent introductions. There's some really good questions coming in, so I'll try and do justice to some of the things which have been put onto the agenda in terms of issues and questions. Now, one thing that's coming up more and more, and I think very noticeable this week, is that the dividing line between workers which are perhaps able to work at home, have decent employment rights, the ability to work flexibly, to work safely, that is, they're in a very different position to many workers which are either, key workers which have been out, like posties and carers and many others in logistics and food or whatever, that have been working throughout the whole of the pandemic, and those that are perhaps been furloughed and now able to work at home. That's really brought out, I think, I suppose the kind of the divisions amongst the labour market with amongst working people as a whole, right? And one of the greatest challenges that we have as a labour movement is always to make sure that we can find common cause across amongst working people, and not be divided by not be divided by those which would seek to divide us. Now, this is how. So I just want to put that out there, because obviously the New Deal for Workers predominantly is trying to first and foremost get a better deal for the most precarious, the most the lowest paid, those with the least voice, those in unsafe working conditions, and those without dignity. But obviously this is an agenda which is a common agenda for all working people. So in terms of trying to bridge that gap and ensure that there is common cause amongst working people, how do you envisage that a New Deal for Workers can knit those sort of different areas of the labour market together? Key workers, non-key workers, and what have you. I don't know if you want to go for that one, Kate, or first.
Sure. So I think it's a really good point, and I think there's a kind of, we've seen quite a lot of kind of talk about kind of 2 lockdowns and some kind of stereotypes about people being at home baking bread while others are literally putting their life on the line. But I do think one thing that I think most people have realised is how dependent we've been on those key workers, basically. I think anyone who does their weekly shop realises that there are people not only selling you the food, but producing the food, delivering the food. I think, it's been kind of mixed views about the kind of clap for carers, kind of messaging, but I think it has been a moment of kind of collective recognition that there are people who are doing unbelievably vital work. I think it's highlighted, many unions have been talking about the plight of kind of the terrible working conditions in the care sector for about a decade now, but I think in the most tragic and awful of ways, we have seen those highlighted and recognised by people right across the economy. And I think there is an opportunity to kind of suggest that, kind of the struggle to get better terms and conditions for those people is all of our struggle. It affects all of us and it matters to all of us, both out of solidarity, but also because we want to live in a country where we have a decent NHS, we have care homes that work, we want to be able to go to the shops without feeling that the people who are serving us are at risk. We want our post to be delivered and feel that those people are safe. And I actually think there's an opportunity to build unity rather than division out of this. And I'm sort of, I'm a natural optimist, basically, But I think certainly, well, I've been doing a bit of media actually at some of the beginning of this. I've had kind of TV presenters saying to me, God, people are being treated appallingly, aren't they? I'm being really surprised by that. And I think, as I was kind of trying to say in my remarks, it has exposed some of the issues that we've been talking about for a long time very starkly. And I think that's an opportunity to build unity and strength on the back of that.
Fantastic. Dave, did you want to add anything to that in terms of finding common cause amongst different sections of the labour market and across all workers?
I mean, I agree with what Kate said. I think this can be done, and it's about how we agree what the narrative is and what the key campaign slogans are. You'll have a lot of competing interests, but I'm a great believer that you have to find, I look at things through the lens of work first, because I'm a trade union leader. And if I could say this in the right spirit, and I'm sure your viewers and listeners will understand this, if I went into a workplace tomorrow and passionate about anti-racist campaigning, but if I went and spoke to a group of our workers and started the conversation by talking to them about the need for them to understand why we campaign against racism, some people, let's be truthful, some people in that workplace will say to me, well, why are you talking to me about that? If I say to them, listen, we are totally in touch with your world of work, with your problems, we're fighting for your jobs. And by the way, one of the things that we also fight for is that we're against racism. I'll get a completely different response, because I would have put that debate in the right narrative. And the reason I'm making that point is, climate change is the same. I think it's how you fit these things, these key labour movement campaigns, to build people together. I personally think that if you see that initially through the lens of the world of work, you've got so much more chance of getting everybody and everybody's common cause and great causes that we all fight for under one umbrella. So it's about people sitting down, it's about coming up with that, and it's about linking it to exactly what we're seeing on the streets today, exactly what we're seeing every Thursday night, a new mood, a new respect for workers in this country. A simple message that would bind people together is this: why don't we just revalue work? Why don't we start talking about people's pay, their terms and conditions for people who have done so much for society versus, let's be truthful, a lot of chief executives who get paid unbelievable amounts of money to break things up, break up the things that we're now fighting to repair. Let's have that debate, and we will get people around the same common cause.
Fantastic, thanks, Dave. Excuse me. And I know something that you've done really well at CWU is ensuring that your bread and butter workplace organising ground game and your and the work that your reps do is just so it's just grounded, and it's very much built on very strong workplace relationships. And those strong workplace relationships, that strong workplace organising allows you to talk about politics, right? It gives you a hearing, and it allows that to be done well. And I think that's that doesn't, and that's really what we're talking about today, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so it's a really good question from Dan Dobson. So Dan Dobson's a construction worker, and he's talking about, hello Dan, by the way, if you're watching. Construction is a notorious sector for bogus self-employment, low standards, bosses that aren't always the most receptive to health and safety, should we say. Now that, using that construction sector as an example of, one of the most difficult sectors to organise at the moment, where lots of abuses take place. What can we do? What can we do in terms of using that as an example for perhaps building on that sort of building a model which can improve the lives of working people in the construction sector, which can then be replicated somewhat in other sectors like, whatever it might be, hospitalities and other sort of food, food production, a similar sector in which, really there is trade unions haven't been able to organise as to the level of sort of density that they would have hoped for various reasons. What is there in terms of new ideas for organising, for winning the arguments in sectors like construction? Do you want to have a go at that, Kate?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just wanted kind of reflecting on what Dave was saying a bit, also to say that I think one of the things we kind of have really learned more than ever in this pandemic is how we can't tackle labour market inequalities without tackling racism, and how it's, some of the kind of unequal effects of the virus on people who are Black has been because of their position in the labour market, because structural racism means they're more likely to work in kind of insecure jobs, they're more likely to work in insecure sectors. And I think thinking about that kind of holistic approach, I will move on to actually answering your question, is going to be absolutely vital, as Dave said, in kind of getting our messaging right as we go forward. I mean, I think construction is a really great sector to talk about because it's one where we've seen people pressured to go out to work. Now, it's one of the sectors Boris talked about, and we've seen, pretty shoddy behaviour. And I think it's one where, it's never been more vital that those people have the protection of the union. And one of the reasons why access to workplaces is so important as part of the union demands is because it's difficult to make those cases to construction workers when you can't get within, 3 feet of the site without being kind of pushed away by a hostile employer. But I also think construction's a place where we've got a real opportunity. So even before this crisis, and deciding whether you believe the government on this or not is up to you, but they were talking about a big investment plan, basically. They were talking about wanting to invest in infrastructure, including in green infrastructure. One of the things we were saying in the run-up to kind of the budget is that should be an opportunity, that investment should be an opportunity to create decent jobs. And what you need to do that is you actually need to have agreements with unions. We do actually have some good examples of framework agreements kind of with unions in big energy infrastructure. Hinkley Point, for example, there's a multi-union agreement, framework agreement on the construction of that big nuclear power plant, and it hasn't been perfect, but it means that the whole supply chain is covered with decent terms and conditions. And I actually think if we're going to be talking about government investing, we should be saying that model, the model that was used at the Olympics, is a huge opportunity to say, this is how you deliver decent jobs. You have an agreement with unions, you make sure that the jobs are being recruited locally, you make sure they have apprenticeships, and you make sure they're on decent paying conditions. And I actually think in some ways, like, construction, as you say, is a hard sector to organise because of restrictive anti-trade union legislation we've got at the moment, but it is a sector where we've absolutely got to be pushing for that. So I hope that's something we can keep talking about in the months ahead.
Fantastic, thank you. Dave, do you want to say any more about organising in sectors like construction? Just construction as a sort of example of a sector where, where certainly improvements could be made and union density could be improved and standards of in the workplace could be lifted. But obviously, it's a difficult sector in which to organise with such restrictive trade union laws as we have in this country. Is there anything that you want to say in terms of different models of organising and that could be spread across sectors, including construction?
Well, I mean, I recognise the point you're making. I'm not an expert in that sector, and I listen sometimes to some of the other unions who are involved in that sector when they talk about some of the problems. Some of those problems go back many, many years. It's the basis of the insecure employment models that are now prevalent in society. But they never used to be like that, did they, years ago? I mean, I can remember a time when construction workers were some of the strongest groups of workers that you ever had. Clearly, health and safety, pointing out at the moment, I think that, you can pretty much guarantee that those sites that will be well organised by unions like Unite and others are bound to have safer working conditions to the ones that are unorganised. So let's talk about that. Let's champion that. Let's use this moment to show that. I think what's interesting at the moment, I think a lot of the workers who are going back to work will be workers who the trade union movement have organised. And I think there's going to be a lot of workers who are a bit more nervous about going back to work, who are going to be in places that aren't organised. And I think we can spread that message along with the work that the TUC have been doing. The other side of this is, where does the government go with the economy? Do we want the government at some point to switch to tap off? If they're thinking they're going to do that, I think they're going to struggle with that, which is why I think we've got a great opportunity to change the way the economy works. So a bit of, government support now for trade union organising in terms of us being part of the recovery, the economic recovery, has to be on the agenda. So these companies that have spent years putting barriers up to stop trade unions organising, some of it illegal stuff that we've seen, the blacklisting of workers. We've got an opportunity here to change that. So I think, again, this is the moment where we move forward.
Absolutely. So sticking with that, sticking with that theme of the positive offer, the positive difference that trade unions are making every single day, and if there was a kind of if we're looking at a kind of battle of ideas or battle of narrative at the moment, you'd think that people are hearing more about trade unions. They're seeing the value of trade unions more. The hashtag join a union has been very popular. There's been obviously a campaign this week from the Labour Party asking all its members to make sure that you are a member of a trade union, get your colleagues to become a member of the trade union. There's also been some positive offers from the trade unions as well, not least with health and safety reps. And, often trade union movement has been sort of pigeonholed as people that want to slow stuff down. Or actually, I think it's very obvious to a vast number of people in this country that what the trade unions have tried to do is make sure that a return to work is a safe return to work, and the expertise of health and safety reps and the guidance with which that trade unions have stepped up and offered in that relationship with government as well. It's been a really good dialogue, I think, between TUC and certain government ministers to ensure that these issues are on the table. Now, I mean, I wouldn't want to be too naive about the future prospects of the trade union movement sitting around the table with a Tory government looking to the future about rebuilding the economy and in a way that works for working people. But I mean, there is something there about government needing the voice of organised labour now to help get people back to work and get the economy moving again in a healthy, secure, productive, high wage, high value kind of model, isn't there? So I don't know if you want to speak, Kate, about some more of the opportunities there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put it really well when you said that government have needed the voice of working people. And I think they've kind of really seen that actually turns out employers and business organisations are not the last word on the world of work, that their voices are not going to reassure their workers due to some of the pretty terrible practice we've seen over the last few years, and that you need the voice of organised labour not only to stand up and represent people in the workplace, but to represent working people at all levels of government. And I think some government ministers have probably been quite surprised to be like, oh yeah, they do seem to know what they're talking about when it comes to the world of work, and sort of have some of their own kind of preconceptions and the stereotypes perhaps challenged a little bit by the way trade unions have been able to demonstrate how in touch with the workforce they are. I think, we've always thought that's a sensible model for going forward. If you look at most kind of, many countries across Europe, that's the model where trade unions are a campaigning force, they're a workforce force, but they are also a kind of voice in government. And that model of kind of tripartite consultation, which has been kind of dismantled from the 80s onwards in the UK, is just a normal part of doing business. One of the things we've called for is a National Council for Recovery and Reconstruction, which will bring together workers, business and government to design the next stage going forward. Think about how we get that growth-led model, not a model of austerity, to think about how we deliver better jobs across the country. And as Dave said, to do that in a way that deals with the other challenges which haven't gone away around automation, around tackling climate change, and to think about how, as we build back from this recovery, we can tackle those new challenges too. I think, trade unions really have shown their worth during this crisis, and I hope that is something that is reflected not just in increased trade union membership, which I very much hope it will be, but also in government taking a different view and a different attitude to how they work with us.
Fantastic, thank you. Dave, do you want anything on the do you want to add anything on the opportunities for more sort of working with government in a more tripartite model, the kind of model that we say is sort of mainstream in Europe, where governments come together with trade unions to, they value them, they work with them, and obviously that the benefits and flow outwards from that. Do you want to add anything on that?
Well, I mean, we have to be at the table. We deserve to be at the table, and I think what the country would have seen, as Kate said again, in the last few weeks, last couple of months, is that trade unions actually talk a lot of sense. I think that we will get a seat at the table, because I don't see where else the government goes. But what I would say is that having a seat at the table doesn't actually bring change.
Yeah.
I say sometimes change is not a spectator's sport. You have to be involved in it, and you have to do both. You have to have a seat at the table, but we've got to organise like we've not been able to for years on the back of this particular crisis. And we've got to reach out to people, and we've got to become a force again. Let me give you an example of what happened in the postal industry a couple of weeks back. We had the employer who decided our concern was we've got a live industrial action ballot at the moment, which we were willing to set aside. Didn't ask for anything from the employer to do that. We actually said that postal workers could be a fourth emergency service, and the last thing we wanted to do was get involved in industrial action. We had a 97% yes vote. We had to convince our members that was the right thing. A few weeks in, the employer decided that it wanted to change the basis of the universal service obligation. And we had real concerns that what it was actually doing was using the pandemic to create the future of the industry, which would have cost us thousands of jobs. So we did both things. We contacted the government, and I have to say, I think they were receptive to what we said, because we put a sensible view forward. We contacted the regulator who regulates our particular industry, and we had a sensible conversation. We tried to contact the employer at the time, but they'd broken off diplomatic relations. So the other thing we did was we said we're going to trigger our industrial action ballot. And the strength of our reps on the front line, we didn't even have to really wait for that to happen. The fact that we have a representative structure that's, I think, one of the most unique in the UK, where every workplace pretty much still has a rep with real power, meant that the managers in the industry were sending a message back saying there's going to be chaos if you don't sit down with a union. It meant that the government were able to see the reality of, we put forward really good proposals and we were being ignored. And the combination of all those things brought a dramatic change. So my point is sitting at the table is one thing, but there's no substitute for organising and taking campaigns forward, and where necessary, showing our strength.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thanks, Dave. I've talked about opportunities. I think we also need to talk briefly about threats as well, because I'm thinking in particular the Treasury note, which was perhaps brief or perhaps leaked to I think it was at the Telegraph this morning, about modelling public sector pay freeze as a way to as a way to cut back on public spending. Of course, that's something both sort of morally and in terms of building a stronger, more resilient economy. That's something that trade union movement will oppose in the strongest possible way, I'm sure. And it's something that I think is obviously opposed by all the polling. All the polling amongst the public would demonstrate that that is something that the public do not want. As has been mentioned several times, the really important work that key workers in many different sectors have been doing throughout the pandemic is really been valued to a high extent. So, but of course, the Conservative reflexes are still there. The Treasury reflexes are still there. How do we make sure as a trade union movement that this is not an option that they are thinking about? This is not an option. This cannot be. We cannot go back to those years of austerity. The trade union movement is too strong. The public won't accept it. How do we land that?
Do you want me to have a go?
Yeah, go on.
So, I kind of read that Telegraph front page and felt like Treasury civil servants appear to have not picked up a newspaper for the last decade. And I think it is worth remembering, or to have had any new ideas, it's worth remembering that even the Conservative Party went into the last election promising an end to austerity. And I think the idea that we can go back to those failed cuts, which left our public services kind of woefully underserved, woefully underprepared for this pandemic, our public servants massively undervalued, still massively undervalued during this pandemic, and people not getting the level of care and service they deserved, is just ridiculous, basically. And I think we should have no qualms about treating that idea with the contempt it deserves. I would recommend an excellent blog by my colleague Mary Robertson on the TUC website, which sets out that argument very eloquently. But I think just kind of also reflecting on what Dave said previously, the source of our power is both political and industrial, basically, and those two sources of power reinforce each other. Of course, our ultimate power is based on our membership, and that's also why it's important people join a union. It's not only because it's the best way to protect yourself at work, but it's the best way to increase our collective power and to make sure that government can't simply impose those pay cuts. But it's also important that, when we speak up politically, we're heard, we're listened to. And I think we have got a great opportunity to do that now. Many more people have heard of, what the TUC is saying. And as you say, Joe, it's completely important, vital we use that voice to say absolutely no return to austerity. That's not acceptable. But I think outside a few people in the Treasury, I don't think there's that many people, and possibly George Osborne, who's been out there talking about it. I actually don't think there's that many people who think that any return to the austerity of the past decade, which has left us in such a terrible state, can possibly be the way forward.
Fantastic, thank you. That's a really good way of turning a question about a threat into an optimistic way of looking forward to the future, which is obviously what this conversation is completely about. We're heading towards 7 o'clock now, Dave. So if any final points, whether that's on public sector pay freeze, whether that's a kind of rallying cry for people to get involved in their trade union, to get active in the Labour Party, the floor is yours.
Yeah, we land the blow against those who are going to take us back to austerity by launching the campaign properly for a new deal for working people in this country. We build on the work we've already done. I think we also need to be open to new models of collectivism. I think there's some fantastic things that have happened that have re-inspired me during this particular pandemic around the value of workers, and more importantly, seeing the value that society places on those workers. I think there's no turning back on that. And I personally think the government will struggle to make any moves that look like they are turning the screw again on workers. I think what we've got to do is point out that this has been decades in the making. This has not happened because of a virus. It's happened because we've had the wrong economic policies. We've had, sadly, we've had decades of union membership decline. So this is a moment where I think we do three things to summarise. One, we look to new models of collectivism. We encourage people to join unions. We encourage unions to work together. We fight for a new deal for workers, and we set out that campaign very clearly. And finally, out of that, we create the new normal.
Fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic way of summarising a brilliant conversation. So thank you so much to Kate. Thank you so much to Dave. Thank you for Helen for your introductions. And thank you for everyone for your questions and your observations. And thank you for joining us. This is the first in a series of discussions on how we shape the new normal. The next one will be a new deal for social care, a sector which has been underinvested in, workers undervalued for a long time. So we'll be looking at that next. That will be followed by a session on rebuilding the social safety net. Again, I think this crisis has shown very, very starkly how many holes there are in the social safety net. So we'll be having a conversation on that. Make sure you follow us on Twitter and Facebook, Labour Unions UK. Final rallying cry, don't forget to join a union. Get on Twitter, hashtag join a union, speak to your friends, speak to party members, speak to your colleagues, speak to people on the doorstep when you're clapping on Thursday. Get them PPE. Let's join a union. Let's build back better out of this crisis. Thank you for joining us again. Make sure you signed up to the Labour Union's email list, labourunions.org.uk, and we'll make sure that you get invited to the next one. Thanks and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.